few weeks ago, my boss told me that he was going back home to Malaysia to attend his brother's wedding. I had never met his brother before. I was surprised when he told me that I was invited as well. My boss and I, we were close, but I never thought that he'd make me his plus one. Turns out he just didn't want to be alone with his very strict Muslim family, and he dragged me along so that they would have someone else to be disgusted with. After the wedding was over and everything was done with, my boss, whose name is Muhammad and shall henceforth be known as Mo, he took me on a tour of his country. On our last day, he took me to his old university, where a friend of his now lectures. After looking around the place and showing me some of the places where he used to hang out and smoke weed on campus, he took me to meet his friend, who went by the name Mikey. After the introductions were done, they did what every group of people do when they see each other for the first time in a long time. They reminisced. They talked about high school, university, and all the crazy stuff they did when they were kids. To me, the stories sounded reasonably normal. But when they grew up in a strict Muslim society, and I grew up in Australia, what do I know? At one point, however, they started talking about their old girlfriends, and the name Triss was mentioned. When Mikey brought her up, I saw Mo's face freeze. A dark shadow hung over his eyes. All traces of a smile faded from his face. Intrigued, I asked him what was bothering him, and I was told the following story. Triss and Mo had been dating for about 6 months when he moved into an apartment block near his university. The apartment he had booked was shared with 5 other guys, including Mikey, and the block itself, it was packed with families. The walls were thin, so they had to be damn careful about making too much noise. Apparently, there's nothing more dangerous than a self-righteous Muslim family who think 7 p.m. is a reasonable bedtime. Anyway, one afternoon, the 6 guys were sitting around watching everyone's favorite action movie, Rambo. Guns and explosions, every teenage guy's favorite popcorn movie. About halfway through, Triss came in, said hello to the gang, and she beckoned Mo into the other room. Mo quickly followed, thinking he was getting laid, only to have Triss wrap him in a hug and press her face into his shoulder and start bawling. Mo stood there silently for about an hour, letting her get it out of her system. After a couple of minutes, Triss pushed him away and smiled. She needed to get changed, wash her face, and she wanted to be alone for a minute. Mo, mildly confused by the whole thing, went and sat outside with everyone else and just kept watching the movie. Nearly half an hour later, Mo was starting to get worried. Triss had been in the bedroom for far too long, and whilst he didn't want to interrupt whatever she was doing in there, he was determined to find out what the problem was. He knocked on the door, and he was surprised when the door swung open almost instantly, and Triss pushed past him, moving to sit on the couch. A space was made for her, and she sat, but with a totally stiff back. Her knees were at a perfect 90-degree angle, and she was perched precariously on the edge of the seat, looking not unlike a gargoyle. She wasn't even watching the screen, just staring at the people sitting on the floor in front of her. Mo approached her cautiously. Everyone had noticed how she was acting at this point, and they were all turning around to look at her. Mo smiled, trying to be reassuring, and he asked her what was wrong. She looked up, but not into his eyes. It seemed as if she was looking over his shoulder. "There's a man outside. I saw him, outside the window. He wants to come inside." "But, sweetheart, we're on the 3rd floor." The reply, it seemed to float through the room. Everyone's attention was fixed on the pair now. But Triss, she seemed totally unaware of everything that wasn't just over the point of Mo's shoulder. Suddenly, she shifted her gaze and stared directly into Mo's chest. Without warning, she started screaming. A piercing, horrifying, open-mouthed scream that exploded the entire room into action. Everyone in the room went to cover Triss's mouth at the same time, and she was knocked onto the floor. Still screaming, she started lashing out, connecting with vicious punches that left horrible bruises. Everyone grabbed a limb, pinning her to the ground, but she was still screaming. The sound of gunshots and explosions from the Rambo movie mixed with the chaos of the room, making that whole scene feel like something out of the Second World War. Mikey suddenly remembered something. It was clear, to him at least, what he had to do. He ran from the room, dug into his bag, and he found what he was looking for. A small vial filled with sand, a gift that his father had brought back from his pilgrimage to Mecca. He quickly filled a jug with water. He then sprinkled some of the sand over it while muttering a few short prayers. When he was done, he rushed over to the group and he started to pour the holy water over Triss, hoping that it would blast whatever the hell was in her free. The effect was a little different. The struggling and the flailing stopped, but the screaming did not. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and the pitch of her scream, it changed from high to impossibly deep. Mikey started yelling passages from one of the holy books of Islam, pouring water on her face and shouting the words into her ear. But it was all to no avail. All it did was make whatever was in her very, very angry. She started flailing twice as hard as before, and the screaming, shockingly, got louder. Mikey had one last plan. He sprinted to the front door and he jammed it open. Then, he did the same thing to the veranda door. He ran back to Triss and he started screaming into her ear, "You need to leave. You can't stay here. We will not let you stay. You have to leave, now." Whilst he screamed this, he poured the last of the water over Triss and he dumped the rest of the sand into her open mouth. The screaming stopped. Her eyes closed and she stopped flailing. Regardless, and suspicious of some sort of trick, nobody moved. They all kept her limbs tightly pressed against the floor, refusing to budge. Mo softly whispered her name into her ear, and her eyes fluttered open. Mo? What are you guys doing? Why am I all wet? Apparently, that's the last they heard from that particular spirit. None of the neighbours made any complaints, and by some minor miracle, Triss had not broken anything with all her flailing. Mikey was pissed that he lost such a precious gift from his dad, but otherwise, nobody was hurt. Later, after they had all recovered a little bit, they asked her what she remembered of the ordeal, and she replied, "All I remember is hearing someone outside and going to open the window to see what was happening. Then, I woke up with all of you on top of me." My name is John, and something really, really bad has happened. I just don't know what. I had been visiting some friends in Malaysia, and I've had a great time. A few hours ago, a friend of mine told me of a forest nearby, which is believed to be haunted. Local people avoid it, and have warned us to not wander around. Being young and stupid, we thought the parents made up those paranormal stories just to deter kids from playing in it. After we convinced our Malayan friend, we decided to venture into that forest. There was a big group of us, around 5 or 6 people, all of us foreigners, except for my friend and one other guy we met. I don't know the man. In fact, none of us do. Whilst walking in the woods, he jumped in front of us, yelling something in Malayan. Our Malayan friend, he said something and urged the man to leave. However, he just looked at us and laughed. We continued on until a loud, devilish scream scared us. For some reason, it scared me more than other people, and my first instinct was to jump off the trail and head into the thick woods. I ran until the voices of my friends were muffled, and I realized I was lost. I became panicked and even more scared. I tried to go back the way I came, but of course, it wasn't as simple as that. I walked and walked, but I heard nothing and saw nothing. The world seemed grey and dead. After a few minutes of walking, I finally saw a friend of mine. I was certain he had noticed me as well, since he raised his hands near his mouth and he started to yell while looking in my direction. I thought maybe he was messing with me. But of course, the reality is never that simple. I began running towards him, shouting and waving, and he did the same. He was about to run right into me when, out of fear, I closed my eyes. My legs were shaking when I realized he had run right through me. He continued walking away, and I followed him. I was certain they were pulling a prank on me, somehow. More of my friends joined him, and they began talking as if I was not there. I was invisible to them. No matter what I did, no matter how much I yelled, punched, or kicked, they were unfazed. They decided to run back to the trail and wait for me there. I tried to follow them, but they moved too fast. Even Brad, who is overweight, ran faster than me. I collapsed to the ground, trying my best to just breathe. The panic was starting to get to me. No birds, no crickets, and no sound of any kind. Nothing. Nothing but the deep and unsettling growl which was echoing through the forest. My phone battery is at 11%. I tried calling them or using the internet for something else, but only Reddit works. The growl. It is getting closer. Please, help. His fever would not subside, I thought, struggling as a surge of panic welled in my chest. Matthew had always been a sickly child, but this was different. I cradled his head, feeling the unusual stiffness in his neck. His eyes looked as though they had seen too much for his 5 years of age. It was the living room. It was the damn house. I fished my phone from my pocket, careful not to disturb Matthew. 11:45 p.m. My partner should have been home by now. A part of me resented her for making us go through this ordeal. I quelled that thought. This was not the time, nor the place, for conflict. She was on call after all. I would call her if she hadn't arrived by 12:30 a.m. My wife, a government doctor, was given an assignment to a rural town in the heartland of Perak, Malaysia. Her assignment was only for a month, and all lodging and expenses had been taken care of by the government. We'd arrived a week prior to an old but respectable colonial bungalow built sometime in the 1800s. A nurse's quarters sat directly opposite of the bungalow. On the day of the arrival, I remarked with amusement to my wife that Matthew and I would lodge with the nurses if she hadn't come home for the night, because the house would have been too big for just Matthew and I. And, not to mention, the house was a bit creepy, especially at night. There were long corridors that would melt into the darkness when night came. Not to mention that antique rocking chair. A crack of thunder pierced my reminiscence and brought me back to the present moment. I heard a dreadful but familiar click as the lights all shut off. I willed myself to remain calm. After all, I was the rational one of the family, wasn't I? Matthew was in no shape to move. Doing so would only worsen his condition. My wife would soon return, and we could talk about moving to a different lodging. After all, it was just the darkness, and no darkness was as bad people. Wait a minute. Did I see that rocking chair by the window move in my peripheral? It couldn't be. I directed my gaze to the chair, willing my eyes to adjust to the darkness, silently praying for that chair to remain still. I breathed a sigh of relief as I saw that it was indeed still. I pinched myself. Snap out of it. paranoia was not doing Matthew and myself any good. Matthew moaned, and I began rocking my body back and forth, hoping that the lull would put him into a restful sleep. Almost immediately, the hairs on my hand began to stand up, and I began feeling an overwhelming sensation of dread. Instinctively, I shut my eyes, unwilling to come to terms with what may be lingering in the room. Supernatural or not, I did not want to know. And then I heard Matthew crying. Although his cries seemed to be coming from the floor above. His sobs, they were agonizing, almost exaggerated, and it was unlike anything I had ever heard. They sounded as if he was tormented. Worse, he sounded not human, as if an entity was making a mockery of what a human child should sound like. Without thinking, I scooped Matthew up and I dashed for the door, running frantically towards the nurse's quarters. I bashed on the reception door like my life depended on it. Almost immediately, a matron opened the door and ushered me into the quarters. Without asking for an explanation, she prepared a room and she asked us to rest for the night. I was too tired to protest as I embraced Matthew and fell into a deep slumber. I awoke in the early morning to Matthew's snores. Gingerly, I placed a hand on his forehead, and I was relieved that the fever had broken. It was not long before I heard my wife asking for us in the corridor outside. In my head, I was ready to convince her that I was not going back to that house. I was ready for the ridicule. It was what we would do to each other after all. I was surprised, however, that she immediately agreed to us staying in a hotel for the duration of her placement in Perak. She told me that the matron had filled her in on the need-to-knows, and she would give me a rundown after we had checked into the hotel. As we left the quarters, the matron gave me a sympathetic look, and without so much as a word, returned to her duties. According to the matron, the house had been haunted by a Pontianak. Pontianaks were women who had died during childbirth. Their spirits would linger in this world, vengeful and spiteful, seeking to be given another chance at motherhood. Unfortunately, there was no way that the nurses could report the hauntings to the government. After all, governments had to rely on facts in making decisions, not superstitions. On that night, at approximately 12 a.m., the matron saw a beautiful woman sitting by the window of the old house, in that rocking chair, brushing her hair. To her horror, the woman removed her head, placed her head on her lap, and sneered at the matron, as if she was aware that the matron had spotted her. I did not blame the matron for not coming to my rescue. After all, the matron had not known that I was even in the house with Matthew, because the lights were all off. Oh, and the matron mentioned one other thing to my wife, almost as an afterthought. A telltale sign that a Pontianak was at a distance was the loud and nearby wailing of a child. However, if you would hear a child crying at a distance, say, upstairs, that would mean the Pontianak was right beside you.